Welcome to the Clement Podcast, where we bring you state and national history locally. We're your hosts,
Jasmin Brand
and Zach Kinslow. If you were just joining us for the first time, thank you for being here. We are recording out of the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum in beautiful downtown Dixon, Tennessee, and aim to bring you interesting tales from the past through the lens of a small southern community.
Today we're going to be talking about the history of mental health institutions in the state of Tennessee.
And that has a really important history here at our site. And of course, we'll save that more for the end of the episode as we all kind of circle back from the beginning to the 1950s with, of course, as you probably guessed it, Governor Frank G. Clement.
This is episode 9, Committed.
Below streamlined highways and teeming traffic, with tall buildings and busy people, Americans are efficient, big, strong. Yet mental illness will strike 1 in every 20 persons in this town. Because of mental illness, the brains, ability, and energy of 1 American in 20 will be lost. Mental illness will take a toll of talent and beauty. Each year, American strength is being wasted because there's a difference between a man and a machine. Because people hate and sorrow and fear, 1 in every 20 will go to another city, a city of the sick, a state hospital for the mentally ill.
That was a clip from a promotional video in 1950 for a mental hospital up in Ohio. It goes on to explain how the buildings are beautiful and they are doing everything they can to help take care of these Americans who are in need. And certainly by 1950, things had started to change, although they had a long way to go. But before we get into that, let's go back to the origins of mental health care in the state of Tennessee. And that really did not begin until later. There were no state facilities until the 1840s. Reliance on care for those that needed any kind of mental health care really fell to local communities, churches, families, friends, and sort of like a, I guess, grassroots crowdfunding is maybe almost what we would call it today.
Like a private charitable organizations, people out of the kindness of their heart. There is no set established medical care when it comes to mental health at this time.
No. And reading about it, it kind of reminded me of the parish system that the UK was reliant on for so long. You had your community hub and all social services came out of that hub. And as this would have fallen under that branch, it really relied on the community. So your mental health care was only as good as the community you were in.
So let's take a zoom out here because we're talking about mental health care and the history of that system in the state of Tennessee. What does the country look like at this time? Is Tennessee just about average that we're seeing, or is Tennessee behind, or are we moving in a right direction quicker than other states might be?
So Tennessee's about average, I would say. In 1840, Tennessee opened the Tennessee Lunatic Asylum in Nashville, and it was the 11th institution opened in the entire USA. Not every state would even have an asylum or an institution until about 1890. Now, the grant for this actually had come several years earlier, so in that respect, maybe Tennessee was a little ahead of the curve. 1832, the state granted $10,000 to build this, which they called at the time Hospital for the Insane. And warning for this episode, we are going to be using terminology that is outdated and in some instances offensive, as it was the language that they are using in the documents that we're pulling from. This is not the appropriate language to discuss this today, but we have to use this language in order to accurately convey thoughts, feelings, discussions of the time. So back to Tennessee granting this money, it would have been about $350,000 in today's money for building this hospital. If you're thinking maybe that's not enough money, you're probably right. It wasn't going to be the most comfortable of resources. They're also not putting a whole lot of actual medical equipment into this building.
So when we kind of look at this time period that we're discussing right out front, we need to remember that it falls mostly within what historians refer to as kind of the age of reform movements. We have the rise of things like abolitionism with American slavery. We've got the temperance movement. We've got women's rights across the board starting to pop up. You got the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls happens in 1848, kind of all within this time period. And one thing that all of these reform movements have in common is they are all almost exclusively ran by, promoted by, and supported by women of the United States. So it's no surprise to me that the history of mental health care in the United States and in Tennessee, we're going to see women kind of leading the charge here. Specifically, probably the mother of this movement, the mother of the asylum movement, a woman from Massachusetts named Dorothea Dix, who had went overseas at one point. She returns to the country in 1840, and between 1840 and 1841 in Massachusetts, she begins kind of a research project. She was teacher at first. She was teaching a class of women prisoners at the East Cambridge prison system there in Massachusetts, and she noticed something that really, really bothered her. She noticed that a lot of the inmates were suffering heavily from mental disorders. They had committed a crime because of their mental disorder, meaning they're not going to be reformed. They don't even really know they committed a crime in most all cases, and the level of care they're getting is none. They're beaten, they are assaulted, and she thinks this is just horrible. And she goes on a campaign to reform this system, if you will. She lobbies the Massachusetts state legislature pretty heavily, writes a lot of articles about these things, and you start seeing states slowly falling into what's known as the asylum movement here, setting up mental asylums that Dorothea Dix is doing. But she does come down to Tennessee and does some work here.
So she comes down in 1847 as she's touring and visiting different asylums and giving them feedback on ways that they can improve, things that they're doing better, and helping states lobby for better facilities. And that's what she'll do here in Nashville. She'll actually tour it in 1847 and find it, quote unquote, deficient. And so she goes to our legislature at the time and she implores them to purchase a larger site for a new hospital where they can treat more people more efficiently and provide just better overall care. And that's exactly what happened. The next year in 1848, the Tennessee state legislature appropriated $40,000 for a new hospital less than a decade after they had opened the original one in 1840. The site was purchased on the Murfreesboro Turnpike.
And you know, Dorothea Dix isn't going to stop in a state-by-state kind of thing. She actually, in 1854, gets a bill before Congress for the benefit of the indigent insane. The bill proposed legislation to provide federal land and funding for the development of new mental institutions. And while the bill was passed by both houses of Congress, it was ultimately vetoed by President Franklin Pierce, who stated that the issue of social welfare should be a responsibility of each individual state rather than that of the federal government. I don't think anywhere in the Constitution does it specifically say this, so I think he's reading it in that way. So he sees it as a state issue, even though the Congress would not agree.
Well, and we still have this debate today of what is the state's responsibility, what is federal responsibility.
And what is the community's responsibility, specifically when it comes to kind of the issue of mental health. And when we get closer to the end of the episode, when we talk about Frank Clement's role in all of it, we'll kind of pull these things together again. So who were placed in these asylums? Now we have places to help treat mentally ill people. Who would kind of be going to these places?
So it's often going to be more of the working class population. If a person had money, they likely weren't going to end up in an asylum unless if there was a specific situation, and actually one that I referenced at the beginning of this episode, and I'm going to talk about more in detail in a moment. But it's mostly working class people and a lot of women. And the reason a lot of women are being placed in here is because first of all, the whole movement is something that is driven by women to help other women, even though the majority of these places ended up being not great places to be in, very negligent, abusive, all sorts of issues coming out of asylums, which is so sad when you think about the beginning intention with what's going on here. But also a lot of the mental health diagnoses of the time are going to be aimed specifically at women to describe why women were the way they were. There seems to be this obsession of trying to figure out how to more perfectly mold women into the image that society wants from them.
And of course, there are going to be a lot of diagnoses which are no longer considered valid. They're considered pseudosciences today. For example, hysteria, female hysteria, which was, I believe, in the medical books until 1980.
Fun fact, 1980 was the first time that women at all, were allowed in the room to talk about the DSM. And the DSM is the diagnosis manual that a lot of mental health professionals use. There has been a little more debate about how official that manual is in recent years. That's a whole other thing. But the DSM is typically what we use to go by to describe different mental health ailments.
So it's no coincidence that when we start seeing women doctors in the conversation, does a lot of the pseudosciences surrounding women's health, women's mental health specifically, start to go away. For instance, I mentioned hysteria. Freud believed that the cure for hysteria was marriage. All other things that are just pretty much ridiculous. Bicycle face, I think, has to be one of my favorite fake diagnoses of all time. It was basically women were more susceptible to it than men, and a woman could get it for basically riding a bike too fast. Their faces would become frozen, would become stuck in one position, and they would be unable to change it, and they would have to be institutionalized for riding a bike.
It's like when your mom said, "Don't make that face because it'll get stuck like that."
Yeah, they thought it actually would get stuck. And it's, we also see the bicycle in a way become a symbol of the reform movement, not just in these fake diagnoses with bicycle face, but the suffragists who were advocating for women's voting rights rode bicycles for this reason and called for dress reform because it's easier to ride a bicycle when you have pants on.
Well, and it gave a certain level of freedom to women who otherwise were mostly at home, because you could get further faster and more easily on a bicycle. So instead of having to just stay in your neighborhood, maybe, you could ride out and see a friend who's a bit further afield, go to the shop. You could get out a little easier. And so, it's just interesting that kind of wraps itself up into a diagnosis that then that person could be placed in an institution for an undisclosed amount of time.
Where there's a lot of power in mobility. The idea that you can kind of go anywhere you want when you want to do it without telling anybody that you're going. And that could be seen as a threat to that traditional sense of home, the cult of domesticity that women found themselves trapped in this time period of American history. But we have set up institutions now, asylums throughout the state, throughout the country, and these people are finding themselves in this situation here.
I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have seen the lists of reasons people were placed into asylums. And while they might have been causes, a lot of them were accurate. Things like wandering womb, emotional overload, the vapors, lunacy were all valid reasons that people, not just women, people in general, would be institutionalized. But also very real concerns such as addiction, depression, PTSD, things that at the time doctors didn't have a proper handle on and even tried to come up with different names for and diagnoses for. Zach, what were you telling me about the doctor that had come up with essentially depression but applied it to enslaved people?
Dr. Samuel Cartwright. He was a 19th century physician that lived in and practiced in Mississippi and Louisiana. He would contribute these articles to medical books, and people picked up with him. They ran with them. And he was focusing almost predominantly on mental health of enslaved peoples. But he's a racist, and one diagnosis, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Latin that he has here, but basically what it said is there is a disease in African American enslaved people that causes them to be tired and not want to work. So he's diagnosing that. He also comes up with another diagnosis called drapetomania, which he said was caused by too lenient slave masters, which basically made the enslaved people want to run away. Not the fact that they were enslaved at all, the fact that they had this mental illness prescribed by Dr. Cartwright here.
Just doing a lot of work to justify slavery.
Absolutely. He believed that it was caused by you being too lenient to enslaved people. So the cure would have to be a slaveholder being harsher to enslaved people. So the medical knowledge at this time it's in its infancy. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there, but that is also going to be informed in the fact that the places that are being created with great intentions to help these people are not going to be good places really for them to be either.
Well, in cases like what Cartwright's doing and what a lot of these asylums are doing will actually hurt people. A little bit later on, things like emotional overload, which again was just probably anxiety, PTSD. There could have been an umbrella for all sorts of things that could have fallen under this. The cure for that, as supposedly, was a lobotomy, which didn't work for even one person that received that. And oftentimes these were performed on women who deviated from the ideas of domesticity. So again, they're being used in malicious ways, I would argue. But then when it comes to things like addiction that has had a proven record of needing some sort of treatment, Tennessee honestly dropped the ball on that. Tennessee passed prohibition 10 years before national prohibition in 1909. In fact, we've done a whole previous episode on that. But the Department of Health at the time did not take any measures, did not provide any special provisions, nothing to help addicts. So 1909, they cut off essentially the supply. Everyone has to go cold turkey. And there are an enormous amount of people who are in need of treatment and just can't necessarily find that. It overwhelmed the system for quite some time.
So up to this point in the early 1900s, the Department of Health, these institutions, these asylums, are actually under the Department of Corrections. The penal institutions, basically the prison system is running our mental health hospitals. And once you are institutionalized, once you are put in one of these places, it is very difficult, especially for a woman, to get out of them. It's not like a prison where you get a sentence, you serve your time. A mental hospital is very different than. In fact, we have a extremely interesting case from this time period. The case of Mrs. Jane E. Plunkett, and I'll let Jasmine take it away because she has done a ton of research on this right here.
So this is a really interesting story I first came across several years ago, and Mrs. Plunkett, or Jane, I'm going to refer to her as, she was an inpatient at City View Sanatorium, which was located in Nashville. And she was placed there in the early 1900s. I want to say it was about 1907, perhaps. I know the court case starts taking place in 1909. And she found herself there because her husband said that she was mentally unstable and that she needed round-the-clock care more than he or their son could provide, their adult son. Now that all sounds very above board and like her family is taking good care of her and doing the right thing. Which makes sense as her husband, J.D. Plunkett, or Dr. Plunkett, had previously served as the president of the State Board of Health. In fact, he was the first ever president of that body. However, Jane had recently come into some money. Her brother, Colonel Thomas Swope, was a millionaire out of Kansas City, and after he passed away, left a large chunk of his fortune to his beloved sister. This included properties, money, investments, valuables of all kinds. And apparently, this confinement or commitment was just the latest attempt by Dr. Plunkett and her son-in-law, Percy Brown, to have her committed. She would later say in court that he had attempted for years to get her out of the way to take over this fortune. And her son-in-law and apparently His wife, her daughter, was even in on it. A newspaper article from 1911 talking about the case, in fact, talking about one of the appeals that she goes through, said that she alleged that she was the victim of a conspiracy upon the part of Percy Brown and his wife to deprive her of her liberty and to gain control of her fortune. And then it goes on to say that Mrs. Plunkett had said that her husband exercised a hypnotic power over her to the extent that he had, by his influence, compelled her to marry him. That's how far she believed that this went. And of course, that does sound like something out of a story. It doesn't sound real. But she did take this to court. It did eventually go all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And the reason for this was, starting in the 1870s, Tennessee had actually started to give some property rights to women. So although this is the early 1900s and she doesn't have full rights, she was able, through kind of a roundabout way, to hold on to her brother's estate and her husband and her adult son-in-law. And I'm guessing her daughter did not like this for whatever reason. And again, we don't know the dynamics of that family, but still, to weaponize the mental health institutions against this poor woman is not right. And she took them all to court on the basis of habeas corpus rights, which are the constitutional rights that protect us from unlawful and indefinite imprisonment. This had been attempted in the past by other women who were confined in sanatoriums, mental health institutions, all sorts of places across the country, but ultimately they had failed. They had never been able to prove that they were being unlawfully detained, even though that's certainly what was happening here. And as the case progressed, the plot became more and more apparent to the court, and her soundness of mind also became more apparent. She was very eloquent in structuring her arguments, and the newspapers were gripped by this story. If you look in pretty much any newspaper in the state, day by day they had a play of what is going on with this case. And she did ultimately win. Judge Matthews, the judge who presided over the case, in his opinion, said it appears that on the face of the proceedings that Mrs. Plunkett had never had a fair, reasonable, and legal opportunity to defend her liberty and the right to use, enjoy, and dispose of her property, which is large. She never had the opportunity to face a jury and produce witnesses on her behalf, nor to be represented by counsel. These rights are common to all under the Constitution of Tennessee. Oh, there is a train. Just one of the things we have to pay attention to when recording so close to the tracks. Where was I? So Judge Matthews is saying these rights are common to all under the Constitution of Tennessee and are so fundamental that I am constrained to hold and decide that proceedings aimed at her liberty and her right to control her property are at this time null and void. So not only was she found to be sound of mind, but her right to control her own property was affirmed under the Tennessee Constitution, according to Judge Matthews. This is huge, and this should be precedent setting, which to a certain extent it was. Several years later, in 1913, her husband attempted to have her again committed in Kansas City, but they upheld her ruling from Tennessee, and she, I don't believe, ever again was placed into another institution.
Did they remain married?
You know, I couldn't find any divorce proceedings. She is referred to as Mrs. Plunkett in all of the other newspaper articles. There was one that talked about her living in a separate household, but I never found any divorce proceedings. That might have been because it was a little tricky to get a divorce in 1909, 1910.
Even if your husband put you through everything that Jane Plunkett went through.
And yes. Irreconcilable differences was not an option. She likely could have applied for a divorce under spousal abuse, but I would have had to have been physical abuse. Emotional abuse was not considered, or financial abuse was not considered an option for divorce. So I don't know that they ever did. I do know that they obviously live separately and that she did get to retain her property. And I believe she did move to Kansas City and kind of stay out her days there, even though he tried to make that conviction follow her, despite it being overturned and her being declared mentally sane. And
I'm sure a lot of that didn't help her overall mental health. I don't know how someone could go through all of that and come out completely fine.
No, and yeah, there's no real record of her after 1913 when she wins her case in Kansas City. So I'm not sure what ended up happening past that. I likely just lived a very quiet life outside of the spotlight, hopefully with all of her money in a very nice house.
And kind of the crazy thing to me is, even up to this point, as much publicity, as much press as the Plunkett case is getting, centering on the idea of mental health, who needs to be there, who can get help there, how is it helping people there, there is still no Department of Mental Health at this time.
No.
It's still all under the penal system. It's prison guards running hospitals, not doctors.
So there is a doctor involved in this case, and Jane does sue the sanitarium for holding her there against her will. And in fact, some of the other employees testify in her case in her favor, and that becomes a whole big part of this precedent that she is setting as well. But yeah, there's still a warden. It's run in a very institutional manner, with no oversight from a mental health board, because there isn't one. And that was the standard across the country at this point. So again, Tennessee isn't being particularly cruel or doing anything unusual, but it is interesting to me that for such a precedent that this case set, that women could sue under habeas corpus and could win and could have rights over their own body even if they were married, nothing really changes.
That is until 1952. When a man from Dixon, Tennessee, named Frank G. Clement is elected to his first term as governor of the state. Now, when Clement becomes governor, he sees this problem. He sees this issue. He realizes the necessity of mental health facilities and good mental health facilities. He agreed that what was happening in the mental health facilities in the state of Tennessee was pretty awful. It was not a good thing going on. And he wants to try to fix this problem. In 1953, Frank Clement, in his first year as governor, works to create the first Department of Mental Health in the history of the state of Tennessee. It was one of the first such departments in the entire nation, not let alone the South, the entire country. Governor Clement would appoint the first commissioner of the department on March 25th of that year, and today, that department still exists. It is the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. And once Governor Clement makes that change, once he creates the Department of Mental Health, we do start seeing improvements in mental health care in the state of Tennessee specifically, is what we're talking about here. Throughout 1960s, we see things like the Green Valley Hospital and School, which is now the Green Valley Developmental Center, opened in Greenville, Tennessee, Far East Tennessee, with 400 beds. 400 more beds were added by 1963 to that facility. In 1961, Moccasin Bend Psychiatric Hospital and Institute, now the Moccasin Bend Mental Health Institute, opened in Chattanooga as a short-term intensive treatment facility with 150 beds. Here in Dixon, Tennessee, we have facilities like Mirror Lake Recovery Center. We have places like On-Site. So that legacy that Governor Clement is going to start in helping these people is still well and alive, and you can see that legacy through our state in these people who are getting the help that they so desperately needed. Clement isn't going to stop there. He kind of branches out through education in this way with kind of mental health and support. Under his administrations in the 1960s, Frank Clement is going to establish the Division of Mental Health Retardation, established in Tennessee Department of Mental Health alcoholism programs, transferred to the Tennessee Department of Mental Health from the Department of Public Health. In 1964, mental retardation facilities and community health centers construction act passed the national level. Tennessee is going to receive about $5 million in federal funds for the construction of community mental health centers during the 1960s. And in 1965, Medicare and Medicaid are enacted. And that begins a shift of some hospitalization and treatment costs from the states to the federal government. The thing that they tried to do in the 1850s, they're going to do in the 1960s, with President Johnson supporting it instead of President Pierce vetoing that. So all of these things come together to really kind of highlight a history of a problem in America that's still a problem in America, a problem we have not solved. I'm not sure if we can solve mental health, but we can solve treatment. We can solve access to treatment. What we see in the past is there was no place. Today we have places, thanks to people like Governor Frank Clement, who saw that need early on.
Well, and I think the biggest lesson for me personally out of doing the research for this episode is that the idea of mental health care treatment is so new. It's so new, and we had such a long time of pseudoscience and treatments that didn't really work and the weaponization of mental health care, that it's really only very, very recently, within some people's lifetimes, that we've had a real dedication and advancement in mental health care, the way we look at it and treat it. And I'm sure, in another 100 years, 200 years, they're going to look back at now and say, oh, they were, doing some weird stuff with mental health care treatment. But it's interesting to see how far we've come so quickly.
All right, and that is all we have for you today. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Clement Podcast. Don't forget to follow all of our social media. You can find us at CRHM_Dixon on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and on TikTok. And as we end every episode here, take us out, Frank.
Precious Lord, take our hand, lead us on.